The Constitutional Court this week ruled that former Social Development Minister Bathabile Dlamini is personally liable for 20% of the costs of last year's SA Social Security Agency debacle. The court also found that the National Prosecuting Authority should determine whether Dlamini should be prosecuted for perjury. Justice Johan Froneman has described this as a sorry saga.
The report by Ngwepi JP revealed that she misled the court to protect herself from the consequences of her behavior. She allowed a parallel process to occur, knowing that she withheld information that would lead to her being held personally liable for the social grants disaster. The office which she occupied demands a greater commitment to ethical behavior and requires a high commitment to public service. The Department of Social Development is as much responsible for the realization of rights outlined in the Constitution as this court is, and she used her position as minister to place herself between constitutionally enshrined rights.
Joining us to get to grips with this move, political analyst Lebogang Pheko and ethics expert Cynthia Schoeman. Let's jump straight into it. Ms. Pheko, does Dlamini deserve to stay in her job? And more importantly, is she actually going to continue?
So I think we have to look at it in a systemic way. I think deserving is a value choice. It's a value-loaded question. There's kind of a broader issue of what is the kind of leadership that we expect, what's the ethical framework that we expect, does she deserve in relation to what the people want, the voters, the way that their money is expended. That's a very important angle. And also, does she deserve in relation to the sort of leadership that we need in order to take our country forward? Does she deserve in relation to the ANC Code of Conduct and to basic parliamentary ethics and the ethics of public servants?
Will Cyril Ramaphosa fire her, though? I suppose that's the most important question. Does he have the political room to maneuver in such a way? Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of things. She brings a huge constituency with her. Of course, she seems to represent the women's vote, the women's bloc. So a lot of these things are not usually about, unfortunately, are not usually about the rightness or the wrongness of a situation. They're more about the political power, the clout, and the gravitas that a person, rightly or wrongly, may carry with them. And those are the sorts of considerations that, despite his executive power, that the president needs to deal with. Of course, in theory, he can hire and fire anybody he wants to, but there's so many other mediating factors to think about. Indeed. Cynthia, let's bring you in here. What does this say about the morals and ethics of our government? I mean, I understand you're a private sector ethics expert, but if we have a government that willy-nilly runs to the courts, uses public money, and is now has been found to have a senior official wasting public money and needing to pay it back, what does it say about our state as a whole?
I think one of the things around, you know, as you say, running to court, I think we've seen a lot of that. And clearly, I mean, that is, to say not ideal is an understatement. But I think the far bigger issue here from an ethical point of view is that a court of the Concord standing has found that she misled the court. I mean, I think that really is a huge issue that I think you can't spin any other way, that whether it's lying by omission or commission, let's be clear, this is really an issue. It obviously contradicts, you know, codes of ethics, parliamentary values, but it also contradicts our values as citizens. We should be looking at our ministers as real leaders in the country who set an example. And, you know, in this case, you know, it is quite the opposite.
So how do we change the status quo, Ms. Pheko? Public officials seemingly not caring when public sentiment turns against them, as long as their constituency doesn't turn against them, and even when court judgments go against them. I mean, for the record, the ANC was invited to this discussion, and they were, quote-unquote, told this has nothing to do with the ANC, go and find someone else to talk about it. So, I mean, how do we change the status quo of political unaccountability? Yeah, so I think you're hitting the nail on the head, because where there's a lack of accountability, then it becomes a culture. A culture develops of lack of compliance. I mean, we're all human beings, and the reason that there are codes of conduct, codes of ethics, you know, the speed cameras, the CCTV in supermarkets, because inherent goodness is not a given, and these sorts of sanctions then begin to create a culture of compliance. And even in our leadership, we need to create a culture of compliance. So, for example, I mean, I was in Uganda a few months ago,
And there was a huge thing in the newspaper. There's a public servant who had gone AWOL with public funds, and it was on the front page of the newspaper, and it basically said, "Do not approach this man. He's a liar. He's a thief. He's a disgrace to this nation, and do no further. Have nothing to do with him." Now, I'm not calling for that level of naming and shaming, but I certainly think that. But we cannot redeploy our issues into different departments quietly and discreetly. And the problem with this is that it also then has seeped and leaked into the public ethos. So it goes right down to the traffic cop, it goes right down to all sorts of things. It becomes a culture of unaccountability, disinterest, but also a sense in which certain people are above the law, beyond sanction, beyond reproach, because this party political machinery is behind them. And yet this party political machinery should represent itself as an institution, an ethical universe, which many people in this country, or most people in this country, whether or not they belong to that party, can at least identify with.
Cynthia, there's not exactly a tradition in South Africa of our politicians falling on their sword in the apartheid era or in the democratic era. So this is far-reaching. I mean, the immediate one that springs to mind is Jimmy Kruger referring to Steve Bantobiko's death as it leaving him cold. He never fell on his sword, and I can't recall any apartheid era minister doing the same. So have we just in many ways adopted what was already a stinking system?
I think that taking real accountability, I think is something that, as you point out, has not happened in the past. So let's not pretend in that sense that it's profoundly different in the extreme of falling on your sword. But I do think that one of the big issues that we're dealing with, having come through the Zuma years, is the sense that no one is held accountable. There's this sort of accountability vacuum. Now we have, again, we have a mountain of evidence with, I hope, more to follow out of the Gupta leaks. But if we really sat down and said, let's name 5 people who've not only been held accountable, but where the consequences have actually been implemented, and among ourselves, we'd probably battled to name it. So that really is the huge vacuum that we're looking at. And it speaks to your point exactly of, therefore, as the ordinary citizen, we look at it and say, you know what, if you're senior enough, you're above the law. Now that is an awful almost thought to be perpetuated in society, because it does filter down. Because then as ordinary citizens we say, for goodness sake, why am I the one who's obeying the law, paying my taxes or doing whatever? Because the examples on high are so obviously different.
2 quick-fire questions before we wrap up, because we're running out of time. Ms. Peko, let's be honest, the opposition parties that are in our political system, they don't have a great record either of putting their heads on the chopping block when one of their representatives have been implicated in wrongdoing or even proven to be involved in irregularities. And I'm talking about the likes of the Tshwane Metropolitan Mayor. You're not following proper processes in appointing people. He's still mayor.
He is still mayor, and I mean, it speaks to a much broader ethic. So what we have done in this country is that instead of dealing with issues, we create mascots. So there'll be 1 or 2 occasional fall guys or fall people who will be who'll symbolically fall on the sword. So you think of a Tony Yengeni years ago who went to, and that's about it. And then you'll think about a Manana, but very, very rarely does this actually lead to anything. And then, of course, a lot of these people tend to be recycled back into the system,
about to say.
Which is then about, and you're quite right, this is across party political lines. And this means that, in fact, it's not just only an ANC problem, but of course, because the ANC is the incumbent, they're the government, they have a greater responsibility, because incumbency brings with it far greater power and far greater access to the wheels of resources, the management or the mismanagement thereof, human resources and human capital, and so on. So they have a far greater responsibility to set the tone. But of course, all political parties, I mean, there's very little virtue in our landscape at the moment.
A quick 10-second answer from you. The private sector hasn't played their role either. I mean, when we talk about ethical behavior coming out in the Gupta leaks, just a quick 10-second weigh-in from you, Cynthia, if you can. Private sector needs to play their role as well.
I think one of the points that should be made in that regard is we have long as South Africans been pointing fingers at the public sector without adequately recognizing that, as in old-fashioned dances, it takes two to tango. That the recipient, for every recipient, there is someone who's offering that. There are other scandals, outside of public sector involvement, and of course Steinhoff is going to loom large forever. But I do think that there needs to be a recognition that the fault lies on both sides and the ethics can be corrected on both sides.
Well, we could chat about this for days and days, but unfortunately we've run out of time. Thank you very much for joining the PolitBureau. That brings us to the end of this week's show. Join us again next Sunday, where we'll be continuing to connect the dots in our political world here in South Africa. The PolitBureau is now adjourned.